What happens when a ruthless gang walks into a local barbershop, confident that they can take control, only to find a large, quiet man standing in their way? At first, they think it's an easy target. After all, he's big, heavy-set, and sitting calmly in the corner, sipping his coffee. But what they don't know is that this man is no ordinary patron. The rhythmic buzz of clippers filled the air, punctuated by bursts of laughter and lively chatter. The barbershop was a cornerstone of the community, a place where stories were shared, problems were solved, and the latest gossip was exchanged. Sunlight streamed through the wide front windows, casting a warm, golden light across the polished black and white tiled floors, giving the space a timeless, welcoming feel. The hum of conversation bounced off the walls, blending with the soft scrape of scissors and the steady clip of clippers, as Jerome, the barber, worked his craft on a client's fade. Jerome was quick with his hands, his movements precise and steady as he navigated the clippers through the thick hair. The sound of clippers in the background was like a soundtrack to the rhythm of the neighborhood. It was a sanctuary for the locals, a familiar place where they could retreat from the stresses of the world outside. In the far corner of the room, Marcus sat in his usual spot near the window. His broad shoulders were relaxed as he sipped from a steaming cup of coffee, the deep mug cradled between his large hands. He wasn't just a regular here. He was part of the fabric of the shop. A retired professional boxer, Marcus had spent years in the ring, fighting not just for victory, but for survival. Now retired from his career, he had become something of a protector in the neighborhood. He still worked out, kept his body sharp, but his focus was no longer on personal glory. It was on keeping the peace in his community. Marcus had seen it all. He had fought in arenas around the world, faced men who were hungry for victory and the fame that came with it. He had taken punches, given punches, and bled in the ring. But none of that compared to the struggles he saw outside of it. His neighborhood was his true fight now, and the barber shop was where he came to rest, to be a part of something that mattered to him. It was a peaceful place, but he knew that peace could easily be shattered. The room was filled with a mix of local chatter, sports debates, neighborhood gossip, and friendly banter. A man in the corner argued passionately that Ali, a local boxer, had the footwork to outmaneuver Tyson, while others debated whether Tyson's knockout power would have been too much for Ali. Laughter spilled across the room as people exchanged opinions, each one more animated than the last. But amid the laughter, Marcus remained calm, a quiet observer, his mind always alert. "Man, I'm telling you, Ali could have danced circles around Tyson," Jerome said with a grin, his hands deftly working on his client's hair. Marcus raised an eyebrow, his deep voice cutting through the banter. "Ali had the footwork, but Tyson had that knockout punch." The shop erupted into another round of laughter, the sound echoing against the walls. It was these moments, these simple exchanges, that made Marcus feel connected to the people around him. The people in this shop were his people, his community. It wasn't just about haircuts. It was about trust, about history, and about the shared understanding that no one should ever take what was theirs or try to shake the peace that had been built over the years. But as the sun climbed higher in the sky, something in the air began to shift. The bell above the door jingled as it swung open, but the sound wasn't the usual cheerful jingle of someone coming in for a trim. The energy in the room changed, just a little, as the door closed behind three men who strolled in with a distinct air of confidence. Their presence felt like a disruption, and Marcus couldn't ignore it. He could tell they weren't here for a haircut. The leader of the group was a wiry man with sharp features and pale skin. His eyes scanned the room with an unsettling sharpness, his movements predatory as he scanned the space, as if claiming ownership. His name was Jack. He was flanked by two other men, Jake and Brandon, who walked just behind him, their postures relaxed but full of arrogance. The trio moved toward the counter, their eyes sweeping over the room, ignoring the people already present. There was no greeting, no casual interaction. They didn't belong here. Marcus remained still, his coffee cup resting on the table. He hadn't even flinched. His eyes narrowed slightly as Jack's gaze landed on him. There was something about the man's demeanor that didn't sit right with him. The air in the shop grew heavy as Jack and his group took their time, their sneers betraying their intentions. This wasn't just a casual visit. "Afternoon, fellas," Jack said with a slow drawl, his voice oozing mockery. He leaned on the counter, his gaze sliding from person to person, sizing everyone up. His eyes landed on Marcus again. "Nice place you got here. Shame if something happened to it," Jack continued, his tone dripping with false politeness. Jerome's hands paused for a moment, but he quickly resumed his work, trying to mask the tension creeping into the atmosphere. "We don't want any trouble," he said, his voice steady, though there was a hint of wariness in it. "Just let us do our thing." Jack's smile widened, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile you gave when you knew you had someone on the edge. He pulled a toothpick from his pocket, wedging it between his teeth as he looked around the shop. "Oh, there won't be any trouble as long as everyone plays along. A small fee, you know, for keeping this place protected." Marcus set his coffee cup down slowly. His fingers rested on the rim for a moment before he pulled his hand away. His jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. His eyes stayed steady on Jack, and the tension in the room seemed to swell. Jack, clearly sensing Marcus's calm but powerful presence, stepped forward, eyes gleaming with renewed arrogance. "You see," Jack said, taking another step closer to Marcus, "some people here need more than just protection. You know what I'm talking about." He glanced at Marcus, his tone dripping with contempt. "What's the matter, big guy? You too slow to keep up, or just too tired to try?" The room fell silent. The faint hum of the clippers seemed to get louder in the stillness. The tension in the room was palpable. Marcus, his broad shoulders relaxed, gave Jack a cool, almost imperceptible glance. The insult seemed to roll off him like water off a duck's back. He didn't need to rise to the bait. He wasn't in a rush to prove anything, but Jack's growing arrogance was starting to wear thin. "You don't seem to understand," Marcus said quietly, his deep voice carrying clearly across the room. "This place is more than a business, and you're not going to bully anyone here." Jack smirked, clearly amused. "Oh, I get it," he said, drawing out the words. "You're one of those stand-your-ground types. Too bad you won't get far." He leaned in even closer, and for a moment, it felt like the entire barbershop had held its breath. Marcus simply met his gaze, unflinching. His years in the ring had taught him to be patient, to let others make the first move. He wasn't about to be provoked, but Jack's smirk grew wider, and the insults only became more pointed. Just as the situation seemed to reach a boiling point, the door jingled again, this time with an almost imperceptible shift in the air. The gang was here to threaten, and they didn't know what they were walking into. The barbershop was tense now, the usual warmth replaced by a sharp, uneasy air. The sound of clippers had fallen silent, and even the conversations around the room seemed to fade into the background. Jack and his crew were not just any troublemakers, they had an agenda. As their eyes shifted around the shop, sizing up the patrons, Marcus could feel the subtle change in the atmosphere. The quiet murmurs of the regulars had been replaced by an anxious stillness. Everyone knew what was happening, the calm before the storm. Jack's smirk didn't falter as he continued to taunt Marcus. The other patrons in the shop exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of how to react. They were used to the occasional disagreement, the occasional rough customer, but nothing like this. Jack wasn't here for a haircut or casual conversation. He was here to claim control. "I'm telling you, Jerome," Jack continued, his voice mockingly conversational. "A place like this, it needs protection. This neighborhood's getting dangerous, you know? Broken windows, graffiti, the usual. Wouldn't you feel better knowing someone's keeping an eye on things? A little insurance never hurt anyone." Jerome's hands faltered for just a moment, the clipper hovering above his client's hair. He had dealt with tough customers before, but there was something unsettling about the way Jack spoke, as if he was used to getting what he wanted. Still, he wasn't one to back down easily. He set the clippers down carefully and glanced around the room, trying to gauge how serious things were. "We don't need your protection," Jerome said firmly, though there was an edge to his voice now. "We've been fine without it. I suggest you leave." Marcus leaned back in his chair, observing the scene closely. He didn't need to get involved just yet, but the air was thick with tension, and it was only a matter of time before things escalated. He could feel it, like a storm building on the horizon. He knew this neighborhood, knew the people in it. They weren't just going to let Jack and his gang push them around. Jack's expression shifted, the mocking smile turning into something more sinister. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a crumpled flyer, which he slapped onto the counter with a flourish. The piece of paper was a cheap printed advertisement for a so-called security service, with a number scrawled in bold letters and a poorly designed logo. It looked like it had been printed in someone's basement, hastily thrown together. "See, Jerome," Jack said with a gleam in his eye, "this neighborhood's getting rougher every day. And a place like yours, it could use someone to keep an eye on it. You don't want your business to get damaged, do you? Things happen when you least expect it. A little graffiti, maybe a broken window, could really hurt your reputation." Marcus felt his muscles tense. He could see where this was going. This wasn't just about money, it was about asserting power, about control, and Jack wasn't going to stop until he had it. Jerome's gaze flicked over to Marcus, and for a brief second, the two men locked eyes. Marcus gave him a subtle nod, reassuring him that he was ready. But Jerome wasn't quite there yet. He still held on to the belief that this would blow over, that if he just played it cool, Jack and his crew would back off. "We don't need your help, Jack," Jerome said, his voice firm now. "We're fine just as we are." Jack chuckled darkly. "Oh, I'm sure you are, but I'm just trying to help, you know? Keep things civil. For a small fee, of course. Some people like you," he said, turning his attention to Marcus again, "might need a little more than just protection." Jake, standing just behind Jack, snickered, his eyes running over Marcus with open disdain. "What's this? A heavyweight champ? Or just heavy?" he sneered. The room went dead silent at that, the insult hanging in the air like a challenge. Marcus's hand twitched slightly, but he didn't respond. He knew what they were trying to do, trying to provoke him, break his calm, but he wasn't falling for it. One of the other patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seat, and Jerome's fingers clenched around the counter, his knuckles white. Jack, however, didn't seem to notice. His focus was entirely on Marcus now. "Well, look at you," Jack taunted, stepping closer to Marcus. "What's the matter? Too slow to keep up, or just too tired to try?" Marcus finally spoke, his voice low and measured, carrying across the room. "I'm not interested in your threats, Jack. This place isn't yours to control, and you're not going to intimidate anyone here." The gang members, who had been getting bolder by the second, looked at each other, unsure how to respond. For a brief moment, the tension in the room hung thick, like a rope pulled tight, ready to snap. Jack's smirk faltered just a little, but only for a moment. He wasn't about to back down. "You think you're the tough guy here, huh?" Jack sneered, leaning in even closer to Marcus. "Let's see if you can back it up." Marcus's expression remained calm, but his eyes narrowed slightly. He didn't need to fight yet, but he knew it was coming. He could feel it in the air, the way the gang members' eyes darted around, the way they shifted their weight, preparing for a confrontation. The moment was approaching, and Marcus was ready. Jack wasn't stupid. He knew he had the numbers, but Marcus was no ordinary man. His presence, the quiet authority he held, had already made Jack's arrogance slip just a little. Marcus could see it in his eyes. Jack was calculating, trying to figure out how to break him, but it wasn't going to happen. Jerome, still standing near the counter, took a deep breath. He knew this wasn't just some random intimidation anymore. It was personal, but he also knew he couldn't face it alone. He glanced at Marcus again, who gave him another subtle nod. "We don't need your protection," Jerome repeated, but this time his voice was stronger. "And you're not going to take what's ours." The words seemed to hit a nerve. Jack's eyes darkened, and he stepped back, signaling to his crew. "All right, fine. We'll do this the hard way," he muttered under his breath. Marcus knew the moment had come. The gang wasn't just here to talk anymore. They were here to fight. And as much as he didn't want things to escalate, he was prepared to defend the people in the shop. He had spent his life fighting for respect, and this neighborhood was no different. "Let's finish this," Marcus said softly, his gaze hardening as he locked eyes with Jack. The gang was no longer pretending. Jack and his crew, now emboldened by the insults they had hurled and the way the situation was escalating, weren't leaving without a fight. The faint hum of the clippers had ceased entirely, and the air felt thicker, charged. Every patron in the barbershop had gone quiet, knowing that the situation had moved beyond words. Jack's gaze never left Marcus, but the arrogance in his eyes had been replaced with something more dangerous. Calculating anger. "You really think you can tell me what to do?" Jack spat, stepping closer to Marcus, his words laced with venom. "Look at you, sitting there like some washed-up fighter. You're just a big joke, aren't you?" Marcus stayed seated, his broad frame leaning back just slightly, his posture still relaxed, calm, but every inch of him ready. His eyes locked onto Jack's with unyielding intensity, not a flicker of fear in them. "Get up," Jack barked, a sharp order now. "You think you're tough? Prove it. Let's see if you still got it, old man." The others in the gang, Jake, Brandon, and the two others who had been hanging back, moved in behind Jack, their faces twisted with contempt. Jake, who had been throwing jabs earlier, grinned, his eyes narrowing with malice. "Yeah, let's see if you're really all talk, big guy." Marcus could feel the gang closing in on him. There was no more pretending, no more empty threats. It was happening. The air was thick with impending violence. The barber shop, once a peaceful sanctuary, was now a battlefield. He stood slowly, his movements deliberate. The moment he rose from his seat, the tension in the room felt even sharper. The patrons, once frozen in place, now seemed to draw back instinctively, giving Marcus space as Jack's gang shifted to surround him. It was a classic move. Try to surround your opponent, break him mentally, and then go for the first strike. But Marcus wasn't going to be broken that easily. "You're the one who needs to prove something," Marcus said, his voice steady, cutting through the tension in the room. His eyes didn't waver from Jack, who stood just a few feet away now, a sneer plastered on his face. "You want to try me? Fine. But don't think you're walking out of here like you came in." The gang laughed, a low, mocking sound that echoed off the walls. But Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't need to. His years as a boxer had taught him how to stay focused, how to stay calm when everything around him screamed for him to act. Jack, seeing Marcus's composure, seemed to hesitate for a fraction of a second, but then his smirk returned. "Oh, we're gonna enjoy this," he said, voice thick with mockery. "Let's see how long you can last, old man." With a sudden, sharp movement, Jake lunged forward, his hands swinging toward Marcus with a crude fist. The gang roared with laughter, their voices getting louder, pushing Jack's confidence even higher. But Marcus didn't even flinch. His years in the ring had taught him to see moves before they happened. He sidestepped with practiced ease, his large frame effortlessly gliding away from Jake's wild punch. Jake stumbled, his momentum carrying him forward, and before he could regain his balance, Marcus was already there, his fist landing a powerful blow into Jake's ribs. The sickening thud of flesh meeting muscle rang out in the room, and Jake gasped, his eyes wide as he crumpled to the ground, clutching his side. The laughter from the gang died instantly, replaced by a stunned silence. They had underestimated him. The man they had mocked was more than capable of defending himself. Jack's expression faltered for a moment, and the others looked at each other nervously. It wasn't just words anymore. It was real. "You got nothing," Marcus said, his voice low, but the intensity of it reached every corner of the room. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't bragging. He was just stating facts. "I didn't start this, but I'll finish it." Brandon, who had been standing off to the side, looked uneasily at Jack. He could see his leader's bravado cracking, just a little, but Jack wasn't ready to admit defeat. He sneered at Marcus, his face twisting into a scowl. "You think you're in charge here, huh? Let's see how you do against all of us." Jack barked, and the others, emboldened by his words, rushed in, closing the space around Marcus. The gang surrounded him now, 5 against 1. They came at him from all sides. Jake, despite being winded, lunging again with another swing of his fists. Brandon following close behind with a chair leg. The others had weapons too. Bricks, pipes, anything they could grab. The violence in the room escalated quickly, but Marcus had fought in places far worse than this. His fists, honed by years of training, moved with precision and purpose, blocking blows with ease, landing punches that forced his opponents back. First, he dodged a wild punch from Jake, stepping in and delivering a jab to his chest that sent Jake stumbling backward. crashing into one of the chairs. Brandon swung the chair leg toward Marcus, but he ducked, avoiding the blow effortlessly. Marcus wasn't just fighting, he was controlling the fight. "You're all too slow," Marcus muttered, his voice quiet, steady, as he spun to avoid another attack, delivering a crushing right hook to one of the men who tried to strike him with a pipe. The man collapsed, gasping for air. The gang was starting to lose their confidence, and it showed. They had expected to bully Marcus, take control of the room. Instead, they were on the defensive now, each move more desperate than the last. Jack, realizing that his gang wasn't getting anywhere, started to step back, his eyes darting nervously as his team faltered. "Get up!" he shouted, trying to rally them. But the fear was in the air now, palpable. His gang was breaking apart. Marcus wasn't done yet. He wasn't going to let them retreat with their tails between their legs. "You've made a mistake," he said, his tone low and dangerous. "You think this neighborhood belongs to you? Think again." The gang, once so sure of their strength, now stood in a circle, hesitating, unsure of what to do next. Their weapons were no longer as intimidating as they had once seemed. "I told you," Marcus said, his voice cold. "This ends now." The gang wasn't going down without a fight. The first wave of attacks had shown them that Marcus was no ordinary man. He moved like a force of nature, his strikes calculated and devastating, knocking one of their own to the ground with every blow. But Jack and his crew, emboldened by their numbers, weren't about to let him walk away unscathed. The tension in the room had shifted from palpable to unbearable. The patrons, who had once filled the shop with the hum of conversation, now watched in stunned silence as the fight unfolded before them. Some had stepped back, others had ducked behind chairs or rushed to the back to avoid getting caught in the chaos. But all eyes were on Marcus, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the violence unfolding around him. Marcus could hear Jack barking orders, his voice cutting through the thick silence that had settled in the room. "Don't let him get away, you idiots!" Jack's voice was shrill now, panic creeping into his words as the gang began to rally. They had expected an easy win. Intimidation and fear were their tools. But Marcus wasn't intimidated, and he wasn't afraid to fight back. The next wave came fast and furious. 3 gang members, Jake and 2 others, rushed at Marcus at once, their movements wild and disorganized. Marcus sidestepped the first strike, a crude swing from Jake's fist, before countering with a sharp left jab to his gut. Jake stumbled back, winded, and Marcus was already onto the next target. The second attacker, a lanky man with a broken nose, swung a chair at Marcus, but he blocked it with ease, catching the chair in midair and shoving it away with one powerful push. The gang member stumbled, falling to the ground with a grunt. The third member, a large, stocky man with a crowbar, saw an opening and charged. His swing was wide and vicious, aiming to hit Marcus in the ribs, but Marcus ducked just in time. His years in the ring had honed his reflexes, and he used that to his advantage. He moved like a shadow, slipping around the gang's strikes, delivering blows with the precision of a surgeon. With a quick movement, Marcus launched a punishing uppercut into the man's stomach, causing him to double over in pain. Marcus didn't pause to watch his opponent fall. Instead, he shifted his focus back to the remaining attackers. There was no time to waste. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a battle for respect, and he wasn't about to let these punks take control of his community. Jack watched the carnage unfold before him, his eyes narrowing as his gang began to falter. One by one, his men were being picked off, left reeling from Marcus's blows. The fear was starting to settle in their bones. They had underestimated Marcus, and now they were paying for it. "Get up! Get up!" Jack screamed again, his voice cracking with desperation. His crew was falling apart, and he was starting to realize that things were slipping out of his control. His bravado was starting to crack. Marcus could feel the shift in the room. The energy was changing, and he knew it wouldn't be long before Jack made his move. The gang was losing their fight, but Jack wasn't ready to admit defeat. He was too proud, too determined to hold on to his dominance, and that pride was about to cost him. As the gang regathered their strength, Jack pulled a small knife from his jacket, the blade glinting in the dim light. His eyes locked onto Marcus, a twisted smile pulling at the corners of his mouth. "Think you can play with me, huh?" Jack sneered, stepping forward, his knife flashing in his hand. "Let's see if you can dodge this." Marcus took a step back, watching Jack with a calm intensity that only made the gang leader more nervous. He knew Jack was desperate. He knew the knife wasn't a sign of strength. It was a sign of fear. Jack was trying to prove that he still had control, that he could still dominate the fight. But Marcus wasn't afraid. The knife wasn't enough to break him. Jack lunged first, a wild slash aimed at Marcus's midsection. The motion was clumsy, not the strike of a trained fighter, but one driven by panic. Marcus saw the move coming a mile away. He sidestepped with ease, his body flowing with the movement as he slipped past the knife. His right hand shot out, grabbing Jack by the wrist and twisting, disarming him with a single fluid motion. Before Jack could react, Marcus was already on him. His knee shot up, connecting with Jack's stomach in a sharp, brutal blow that sent the smaller man staggering back, gasping for breath. The knife clattered to the floor, forgotten, as Jack's hands instinctively went to his bruised ribs. The gang members, seeing their leader falter, hesitated for a moment. They were starting to realize they weren't going to win this fight, but they couldn't leave now. Jack had dragged them into this mess, and they weren't about to back out. Jake, still winded from his earlier fall, recovered and lunged again, this time pulling a makeshift weapon, a broken bottle, out of his jacket pocket. He swung it wildly at Marcus, but Marcus was already prepared. He blocked the strike with his forearm, the glass scraping against his skin, but the force of the impact didn't slow him down. With a sharp movement, Marcus grabbed Jake's arm, twisting it behind his back and forcing the broken bottle from his hand. The thug yelped in pain, but Marcus wasn't finished. With one swift motion, he spun Jake around and sent him crashing into a stack of chairs, knocking him out cold. By now, Brandon, the only remaining gang member besides Jack, had backed away, his eyes darting toward the exit. He wasn't looking for a fight anymore. He was looking for an escape. His bravado had been shattered, and he could see the writing on the wall. But Marcus wasn't going to let him go so easily. "You're not running," Marcus said, his voice low and commanding. Brandon stopped in his tracks, but his hands shook as he reached for the door handle. Marcus, with a calm precision, moved forward, his steps deliberate, as if he were walking to the door himself. But he was faster. Before Brandon could open it, Marcus was there, blocking his path. "You have one chance," Marcus said, his voice carrying the weight of a lifetime of fights. "Walk away." Brandon's eyes flicked to the door, then back to Marcus. His chest rose and fell rapidly as he considered his options. But Marcus's unwavering gaze told him everything he needed to know. There was no escaping the consequences of his actions. And with that, Brandon slowly lowered his hands, taking a step back. The chaos in the barbershop had reached its boiling point. Marcus stood in the center of the room, his chest heaving, sweat dripping down his brow, but his focus never wavered. The gang members were staggered and struggling, but they weren't done yet. They had to make a final push if they were going to walk out of this alive. Jack, battered and breathing heavily, struggled to keep his composure as his remaining crew circled around Marcus, like wounded animals trying to regain control. Jack's eyes flicked between his men and Marcus, his expression darkening as he watched his crew crumble. They weren't just losing this fight, they were being humiliated. The feeling gnawed at Jack's pride, making him desperate. Desperate enough to take bigger risks. He could sense the change in the room. The tables were turning, and they weren't going to win through brute force anymore. "Come on!" Jack shouted, his voice shaking with rage. "We've got him! Don't let up now!" His words barely masked his growing panic. He wasn't just commanding his crew, he was trying to convince himself that they still had a chance. But the doubt was starting to show in his eyes, his face bruised and bloodied from the earlier exchange. Marcus had already made his point. He wasn't going down, not by their hands, and certainly not with Jack's blustering threats. Jake, still groaning on the ground from the impact of Marcus's punches, began to stir. His eyes were blurry, but his anger flared as he pushed himself to his feet. "Get him! He's not as tough as he looks," Jake shouted, trying to rally the gang, though his voice lacked the strength it once had. He was the first to charge, a wild desperation fueling his movements. Jake grabbed a nearby stool, swinging it wildly at Marcus with all the force he could muster. The stool hit Marcus's arm with a dull thud, but the force wasn't enough to slow him. Marcus, already anticipating the attack, twisted his body just enough to absorb the blow and stepped to the side, effortlessly sidestepping the strike. With a sudden movement, he grabbed Jake by the wrist and wrenched the stool from his grasp. The next moment was a blur. Marcus swung the stool in one smooth motion, catching Jake across the chest with the edge of it. The force sent Jake stumbling backward, knocking him off balance and slamming him into the counter. Jake hit the floor hard, groaning as he struggled to breathe. The shop was silent for a brief moment, the sudden impact of the fight's shifting momentum hanging in the air. Jack, Jake, and the rest of the gang were beginning to realize the truth. They had underestimated Marcus, and now the consequences of that mistake were laid out before them. The fight was no longer a chaotic scramble. It was a matter of survival, and Marcus was the one who controlled the pace. Brandon, who had been standing by the door, glanced nervously at his comrades. His eyes darted to the window, his thoughts clearly on escaping. But Marcus wasn't going to let that happen. With his frame imposing in the doorway, Marcus took a few slow, deliberate steps forward. He wasn't charging in, but he was closing the distance between him and the remaining attackers, making it clear that they had nowhere to go. "You think you can just walk away from this?" Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying an edge that was sharp enough to cut through the tension. "You came here to cause trouble. Now you'll leave with the consequences." Brandon's face went pale as Marcus moved toward him, each step calculated and steady. He was no longer running away from this. He had no choice but to face it head on. The rest of the gang seemed to hesitate for a moment, doubt creeping into their eyes. They were tough when they had numbers, when they had weapons in hand. But Marcus wasn't afraid. He was a boxer, a professional fighter. They had no idea what they were up against. Even now, as their pride crumbled and their attempts grew more desperate, Marcus remained a steady force, like a rock in a storm. He wasn't just defending the shop, he was sending a message. This neighborhood was his, and no one was going to take it from him. Jack, however, wasn't done. His pride still burned, though it was flickering now. His hand went to the knife at his side, his fingers brushing over it in a last-ditch effort to regain control. But Marcus saw it before Jack could make a move. "Put it down," Marcus commanded, his voice firm but calm. Jack hesitated, his eyes darting to the knife in his hand. The fear in his eyes flickered, but it was quickly replaced with frustration. He wasn't backing down. Not now. His face twisted into a sneer, and he lunged, the knife flashing in his hand as he aimed for Marcus. Marcus was faster. His years of training had sharpened his reflexes to a point where Jack's desperate strike was easily anticipated. Marcus sidestepped the knife, his movements fluid and controlled, then grabbed Jack's wrist in a vice-like grip. Jack's face contorted in pain as Marcus twisted the knife from his hand, disarming him effortlessly. Without wasting a second, Marcus shoved Jack against the counter with enough force to knock the breath from his lungs. Jack gasped, his back slamming against the edge of the counter. But Marcus wasn't done yet. He stood there for a moment, looking down at the gang leader, his chest rising and falling with steady breaths. "You're done," Marcus said, his voice quiet but full of conviction. "This shop's off limits." Jack's eyes were wild with fury, but he couldn't bring himself to move. He had already lost. The others, seeing their leader defeated, began to falter. Brandon had his back to the door now, frozen in place, his hands trembling. The fight had gone out of them. The group that had walked into the barbershop so sure of themselves now looked like a shell of what they had been. "Go," Marcus said, his voice calm, but with the unmistakable weight of authority. "Take your people and leave, and don't come back." For a long moment, there was only silence. No one moved. Jack, broken and humiliated, glanced around at his gang. Jake was out cold, lying motionless on the floor. The others looked disoriented, afraid. Jack took a step back, his fists clenched at his sides, but he knew there was no fighting left in him. "Let's go," Jack muttered, barely above a whisper, his pride too shattered to offer a defiant last word. He turned and motioned for Brandon to follow. Brandon hesitated for a moment, but Marcus's gaze was unwavering. It was like a silent command, one that couldn't be ignored. With one last fearful glance at the towering figure of Marcus, Brandon quickly bolted toward the door, slipping out into the street as fast as he could. The fight had barely ended before the sounds of sirens began to echo in the distance. The barber shop, once alive with laughter and conversation, now lay in eerie silence. Broken chairs, shattered glass, and scattered weapons told the story of the battle that had just taken place. The faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead seemed louder now, as if the world was holding its breath. Marcus stood in the center of the room, his chest still rising and falling with the exertion of the fight. His fists were clenched, though the adrenaline from the battle had already started to fade, leaving behind the exhaustion of physical combat. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his eyes scanned the wreckage around him. Jake and the other gang members were no longer a threat, but their presence still lingered in the air. Jerome stood behind the counter, looking at Marcus with a mixture of awe and disbelief. The older man's hands were still trembling from the chaos, but his expression was one of gratitude. He hadn't expected the situation to escalate like this. No one had. But Marcus had handled it with a calm intensity that had been nothing short of impressive. "Man," Jerome muttered, running a hand over his head. You really took care of them. I don't know how to even thank you." Marcus glanced over at him, his expression still stoic but softened by a quiet understanding. "You don't need to thank me. This is just what we do here. We stand up for what's ours." Jerome nodded slowly, but there was a look in his eyes that spoke volumes. He had always known Marcus as a quiet, reliable presence, but this was something else entirely. The community owed him more than just a thank you. Outside, the sound of tires screeching against the pavement grew louder, followed by the blaring sirens of a police car approaching. Marcus straightened, wiping the sweat from his brow as he turned to face the door. The sirens were a reminder that while the fight had been won, the consequences were still to come. He had no intention of running from them, though. He wasn't afraid of what the law might do. It wasn't about them, it was about the community. The door swung open, and two uniformed police officers stepped into the barbershop, their badges gleaming in the dim light. The older officer, a man with thinning hair and a weary look in his eyes, immediately took in the scene. His eyes scanned the room, noting the broken furniture, the bloodstains, and the defeated gang members sprawled across the floor. "You're Darius Cole, right?" the older officer asked, pulling out a notepad as he approached Marcus with a slow, measured pace. His voice was flat, almost indifferent, as if he had seen this kind of thing before. Marcus nodded, unfolding his arms but keeping his posture calm. "That's me." The officer's gaze flicked to the chaos around him, but there was no real sign of surprise. "We got a call about some kind of disturbance here. Care to explain what happened?" Jerome stepped forward, clearly eager to take control of the situation. "Those punks came in here, trying to shake us down for protection money. Darius here," he said, gesturing to Marcus, "took care of it. They tried to mess with the wrong people." The younger officer, standing near the door with his arms crossed, scoffed under his breath. "Let me guess, another local gang trying to shake down the businesses, huh? No surprise there." The older officer glanced at the young man but didn't respond. Instead, he focused his attention on Marcus. "So you just handled it, huh?" His tone was almost accusatory, as though he was waiting for Marcus to admit something that didn't add up. "Is that how this went down?" Marcus remained calm, meeting the officer's gaze. "I didn't start it, but I wasn't going to let them trash this place." The officer raised an eyebrow, clearly not convinced. "And no one got hurt?" he asked, his voice flat. Jerome stepped in again. "A couple of bruises, sure, but nothing serious. These guys were trying to take over the neighborhood, and Darius wasn't about to let that happen. He's got a history here, a reputation." The officer sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "You know you're not making this easy for us, right? These guys are bad news. We've had our eyes on them for months." Marcus didn't flinch. "If you had done something sooner, this wouldn't have happened." The younger officer, seemingly more dismissive, chimed in. "What's your plan now, huh? You're just gonna let it go?" Marcus didn't respond to the officer directly. Instead, his eyes scanned the room, resting on the broken glass, the overturned chairs, and the weary faces of the patrons. He knew the community was watching, and in that moment he realized that it wasn't just about the fight he had just won. It was about what came next. "They'll be dealt with," Marcus said quietly, "but I'm not waiting around for you guys to fix it." The older officer nodded slowly, taking a few notes in his notepad. He glanced up at Marcus, as though weighing his words. Look, we don't have the resources to patrol every block, but we'll make sure these guys stay off the streets. You've got my word on that." "And the rest?" Marcus asked, his voice steady. "What about the people they've been terrorizing?" The officer gave him a hard look, but his expression softened. "We'll handle it. But you should know, taking the law into your own hands, that's not always the best way." Marcus met his gaze, his expression unshaken. "Sometimes, it's the only way." The younger officer opened his mouth to argue, but his partner cut him off with a raised hand. "Let's go. This place has had enough trouble for one day." With that, the two officers turned and headed for the door, their footsteps echoing in the now silent room. The bell above the door jingled again as they left, leaving behind a heavy silence in their wake. Jerome exhaled deeply, his body visibly relaxing as he leaned against the counter. "Well, that's done. I don't know what else to say, Darius. You really took care of things in here." Marcus, his gaze still focused on the door, shook his head slowly. "It's not over, but it's a start." As he spoke, the door jingled again, and this time it was different. People from the neighborhood, neighbors, old friends, even some regulars who had been watching from the back, started to trickle into the shop. Some had tools in hand, others brought supplies to help with the cleanup. A couple of men started fixing the broken window, while others began sweeping up the mess. The place was coming alive again, but this time it wasn't just Marcus and Jerome, it was the entire community. An elderly woman carrying a tray of pastries walked up to Marcus, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. "I don't know what we would have done without you." Marcus smiled faintly, brushing a hand across his shirt as he replied, "I'm just doing my part." Jerome, watching the scene unfold, clapped Marcus on the shoulder. "You know, they weren't kidding when they said this place belongs to the neighborhood, but after today, I think we can say it really does." Marcus turned back toward the street, his eyes narrowing as he saw a familiar figure walking down the sidewalk. It was Brandon, the last member of the gang who had fled, moving cautiously, as though he was unsure whether to return or stay hidden. Marcus sighed quietly, knowing this wasn't the last time they'd see trouble. But for now at least, the fight had been won. The neighborhood had been protected, and that was enough. The scene inside the barber shop was shifting. The fight had ended, but its impact was still reverberating through the room. The sound of the police officer's departure had faded, replaced by the clinking of tools and the low hum of voices. People from the neighborhood had begun filtering in, each one carrying something to contribute. Wood planks, paint cans, brooms, and even a cooler of drinks. The cleanup had begun, but more than that, the restoration of what had been broken, physically and symbolically, was underway. Jerome stood near the counter, his hands resting on the worn wood as he watched the work unfold. His mind was still processing everything that had happened. A man who had spent years cutting hair and holding conversations was now standing in the middle of a battlefield, with the echoes of violence still hanging in the air. He couldn't quite fathom how fast things had escalated, but one thing was certain: it had been necessary. He glanced over at Marcus, who was standing by the window, arms crossed over his chest as he watched the neighborhood come together. His expression was unreadable, but Jerome could sense that Marcus was still processing the fight in his own way. The man had fought for so many years, first in the ring and now apparently for the people he cared about. But Jerome knew that there was always more beneath the surface. "You good?" Jerome asked, his voice low as he approached Marcus. Marcus didn't look away from the window immediately, his gaze fixed on the people working outside. Finally, after a long pause, he spoke. "Yeah, I'm good. Just thinking." Jerome nodded, understanding the weight of Marcus's words. He had seen the way Marcus fought, the way he defended the people and the shop without hesitation. But Jerome also knew that Marcus wasn't just fighting for the barbershop, he was fighting for the community, for something bigger than himself. "We don't get people like you around here often," Jerome said quietly, his tone heavy with gratitude. "I've known a lot of tough guys, but you're something else. You didn't just defend this place, you stood up for everyone in here." Marcus didn't respond right away, but there was a faint flicker of a smile on his face. He glanced back at Jerome, his expression softening for the briefest moment. "You've done more for this place than anyone else has in a long time," Marcus said, It's not just me, it's everyone. That's what makes this community strong. Jerome's eyes flicked to the window, where the sounds of people organizing and working were becoming more pronounced. Neighbors were already fixing up the shop, hammering new boards into place, repainting the walls and cleaning the debris from the earlier fight. The feeling in the air was changing. There was a sense of unity, a collective purpose that hadn't existed before. Marcus couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in the way things were turning out. The fight had been tough. He'd been pushed to his limits, and there were moments when he wondered if they were going to win. But now, seeing the neighborhood come together to restore what had been broken, he realized that the fight hadn't been just about defeating the gang. It had been about sending a message. The sound of laughter from outside broke his train of thought. He turned to see a group of kids playing nearby, their voices rising in playful shouts as they worked together, moving broken chairs and pushing brooms to help clean up the mess. A woman walked past with a basket of fresh food, offering a plate to a group of older men who had come to lend a hand. The spirit of the neighborhood was alive, and Marcus knew that this was what mattered most. As he watched, he felt a shift deep inside him. This wasn't just a place where he came to relax anymore. It wasn't just a shop or a building. This was home, and the people here were his family. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he truly belonged. A voice called out to him, interrupting his thoughts. He turned to see an older man approaching, a familiar face he had known for years. His name was Earl, and he had been a regular at the barbershop for as long as Marcus could remember. "Hey, Darius," Earl said with a wide grin, his voice rough but warm. "I see you've been busy." Marcus smiled and nodded, stepping toward him. "Just doing what needed to be done." Earl glanced around the shop, his eyes taking in the scene. "Yeah, I see that. We all saw what went down, and we're grateful. Not just for you, but for what you're doing here. We need someone like you in this neighborhood, someone who won't back down no matter what." Marcus looked out the window again, his gaze drifting to the street outside. "It's not just about me, Earl. It's about all of us. This neighborhood, this shop, doesn't belong to anyone except the people who make it what it is." Earl chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You're right about that, but you're the one who showed us that. You're the one who made sure we still have a place to come back to." Marcus didn't respond. Instead, he looked out at the crowd gathered in front of the barbershop, neighbors working together, cleaning up the mess that had been left behind. The fight had been necessary, but this, the rebuilding, the collective effort, was what truly mattered. The gang had come into this neighborhood thinking they could control it, thinking they could intimidate the people who lived here. They had underestimated Marcus, but more importantly, they had underestimated the strength of the community. This wasn't just a fight for the barbershop, it was a fight for the heart and soul of the neighborhood. "I don't know what's next," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I know one thing, I'm not going anywhere." Earl slapped him on the back, his grin widening. "Good, because we need you here." The sounds of the work outside grew louder, the energy of the neighborhood rising as people continued to restore the shop. They were reclaiming what was theirs, not just physically, but symbolically. The message was clear. This place wasn't just a business, it was a sanctuary, and Marcus was part of that foundation now. The barber shop was starting to feel like its old self again, but with an added layer of something deeper, a sense of renewal. The afternoon sun filtered through the windows, casting long golden beams across the freshly swept floor. The broken windows had been replaced, the chairs were being repaired, and the walls, once marked with the chaos of the previous fight, were now covered in fresh paint, bringing life back into the space. The smell of paint and fresh wood mingled with the scent of coffee brewing in the corner. And for the first time since the fight had started, Marcus allowed himself to relax. He had spent the last few hours helping where he could, though most of the hard work had been taken care of by the neighbors. He'd watched the community come together in a way that he hadn't seen before. It was as if the fight had done more than just push back the gang. It had awakened something in everyone. It had united them, showing them what they could accomplish when they stood together. Marcus leaned against the counter, his gaze drifting out the window to the street outside. The sound of hammers and drills filled the air, but his thoughts were distant, taking him back to the fight and the moments that had led up to it. It had been hard, more intense than he had expected, Every punch, every movement had been a reminder of his past life as a boxer. But it wasn't the same. This wasn't a match for a championship belt. It was a fight to protect what mattered, to protect the people who relied on him, even if they hadn't asked for his help. Marcus sighed, his hand running over his face. He had spent so many years in the ring, fighting for himself, for the glory and recognition that came with victory. But this fight had been different. It wasn't about him. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about the people around him. It was about standing up for a community that needed him, whether they realized it or not. Jerome walked up to him, wiping the sweat from his forehead. He was smiling now, his usual confidence returning as he watched the neighborhood continue to work together. He clapped Marcus on the back, his voice full of gratitude. "I can't believe what's happened today, man. This place, it's coming back together. You were right. We're not just a shop. We're a part of something bigger." Marcus gave him a small smile, though there was still a weariness in his eyes. "I know. I just didn't expect it to happen this way. Didn't expect to see everyone come together like this." Jerome chuckled, shaking his head. "You know, I've been here for years, and I've never seen anything like this. People just showing up, ready to help. It's like they know what's at stake now. I think they get it. And I think you've made them see that." Marcus's gaze turned back to the street, the weight of Jerome's words sinking in. He hadn't just fought for the shop, he had fought for the people, for their sense of security, for their ability to hold on to what was theirs. It wasn't just about muscle and strength, it was about something deeper, something more fundamental. It was about respect, and the neighborhood had earned his respect long ago. The bell above the door jingled softly, signaling the arrival of another group from the community. A couple of younger men walked in, carrying fresh buckets of paint, a few older women carrying more tools and cleaning supplies. The shop was buzzing with life again, and Marcus couldn't help but smile as he watched the scene unfold. It was like watching a team rebuild, not just a physical structure, but a sense of trust and unity. They were making it their own again. Earl, the older man who had approached Marcus earlier, came in with a group of his friends, all of them ready to lend a hand. They weren't just offering help, they were offering something more: solidarity. The fight had been hard, but the aftermath was even harder. It was about making sure that the damage didn't last, that the fear didn't settle in. "Darius!" Earl called out, his voice full of energy as he made his way over to Marcus. "I heard what you did for this place, and I'm not the only one. Everyone's talking about it. This neighborhood owes you more than a thank you." Marcus nodded in acknowledgement, but there was a humility in his response. "It wasn't just me, Earl. We all did this together. I'm just one part of it." Earl grinned, clapping Marcus on the back. "True, but you've earned more than just the thanks. You showed everyone what happens when you stand up for your own. You showed them what respect really looks like." As the workers continued to fill the shop with energy and life, Marcus couldn't help but reflect on what had happened. It had been more than just a fight against the gang. It had been a battle for the future, for the idea that no one should be able to walk into a place and take what didn't belong to them. It was about standing up for the dignity of the neighborhood, for the people who live there and work there every day. And that fight, as exhausting as it had been worth every moment. The door jingled once more, and Marcus turned to see a young woman step into the shop. Her face was familiar, one of the regulars who came in for haircuts every few weeks. She walked hesitantly into the shop, her eyes scanning the space. When she saw Marcus standing near the counter, her expression softened. "Is it safe to come in?" she asked, her voice cautious but curious as she stepped closer. Jerome waved her in, though his hand trembled slightly. "Yeah, it's fine now. It's all taken care of. Come on in." The woman smiled, though there was a hint of worry in her eyes. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said to Marcus, her voice quiet but sincere, "for what you did today, for protecting us." Marcus gave a small, respectful nod. "It's no problem, just doing what needed to be done." She stepped further inside, exchanging a few words with the others who had gathered to help clean up, and slowly, the mood in the shop began to lighten. The fight had been hard, but the rebuilding process had been even harder. And it wasn't just about restoring the physical space, it was about restoring faith in each other. Trust in the people who had your back, who were there when it counted. Marcus knew this wasn't over, that the gang would try to find a way to retaliate. But for now, the neighborhood had shown him something more valuable than any championship belt. Unity. The kind of unity that made it clear that when one person stood up, the entire community stood with them. And for Marcus, that was enough. The sun was beginning to dip low, casting a golden hue over the barbershop as the final touches were made to the repairs. The sound of hammers, drills, and brushes was now a harmonious symphony of effort. The shop was coming back to life, just as the neighborhood was. The damage from the gang's visit had been extensive, but it hadn't broken the spirit of the community. If anything, it had strengthened it. Marcus stood by the door, his arms crossed as he watched the work unfold. The shop had always been a place of refuge for people, but today, it had become a symbol of something greater. It was no longer just a barbershop, it was a testament to what the people could accomplish when they stood together. The resilience of the community had shone through in every nail hammered into the walls, in every sweep of the broom, and in every word of encouragement shared by the neighbors. It was quiet now, peaceful in a way it hadn't been since the fight. The crew was wrapping up the last of the repairs, and people were starting to gather outside, their voices rising in conversations, laughter, and smiles. The sound of life returned to the block. People who had once looked at each other warily now exchanged nods and greetings, and Marcus could feel the bond between them grow stronger. This was their neighborhood, and they were all in this together. "Hey, Darius!" Jerome called from the back, waving a paintbrush in his hand. He was standing by the window which had been newly installed and was already gleaming under the light. His face was flushed from the day's work, but there was a smile on his face that told a different story, a story of pride. "Come check it out. The place is looking better than ever." Marcus smiled faintly as he walked toward the counter. He took in the fresh paint on the walls, the polished floor, and the neatly arranged chairs. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. It was home. Jerome stepped back and admired the work for a moment, his gaze softening as he took it all in. "You know," he began, "this place means more than just a haircut. It's always been more than that. But today it feels different. It feels like we've all got each other's backs. You made that happen." Marcus nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on the neighborhood outside. The community was starting to drift back into the barber shop, some with bags of food, others with more supplies, still others just coming to show their face. Marcus saw the pride in their eyes, the sense of ownership that now permeated the air. This was their space, their place of refuge, and they had earned it. "I didn't do it alone," Marcus said quietly, his voice steady. "This is all of us. This shop, this neighborhood. It's about everyone coming together." Jerome nodded, but his smile grew wider. "Yeah, I guess you're right. But still, what you did today, it's going to be remembered." As they spoke, a young woman walked in, her face lit up by the sight of the newly restored barbershop. She smiled, her eyes wide with relief. "I thought this place was gone for good," she said softly, "but it looks even better than before." "It's not just the shop that's getting fixed," Marcus said, turning to her with a smile. "It's everything. We're all in this together." The woman's eyes softened and she nodded in understanding. She had lived in the neighborhood long enough to know that things could change in an instant, that peace could be shattered by the slightest provocation. But today, peace had been restored. And it wasn't just the restoration of a physical space, it was the restoration of hope. As the evening wore on, more and more people came through the door, each one bringing something to contribute. It wasn't much, just a few hours of work, a smile, or a kind word. But it was enough. The community was healing, and that, more than anything, was what made Marcus proud. The door jingled again, and Marcus turned to see Earl and a few others from the neighborhood walking in, carrying a large cooler of drinks. Earl made his way toward Marcus, a wide grin on his face. "Look at this place," Earl said, surveying the shop. "It's like nothing ever happened. And it's all thanks to you, Darius. The people are grateful, man." Marcus smiled faintly, but there was something more profound in his expression now, something that reflected a deep understanding. It's not just about me, Earl. This community showed me something today. They showed me what it means to really fight for something bigger than yourself. That's what this place is. It's about the people who come here, not just for a haircut, but for a place to belong. Earl's grin softened as he placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. Well, you've given us a reason to fight for it too. The group gathered around Marcus and Jerome, and for the first time since the fight, the shop was filled with something that felt real. It wasn't just relief, it was pride, a shared sense of accomplishment, and most of all, respect. As the night wore on and the community continued to pour in, Marcus took a step back, his mind quiet as he observed the work that had been done. It wasn't just about fixing the windows or putting up new walls. It was about rebuilding what had been broken: trust, unity, and respect. He had fought for this, but he had also been changed by it. He had come to understand that sometimes the most important battles weren't fought in the ring or on the streets. They were fought in the hearts of the people who refused to back down. As the evening turned into night, Marcus stood by the counter, looking out at the neighborhood. The street was quieter now, the people heading home after a long day of work. But Marcus knew that the fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. There would be more challenges, more struggles, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel alone. This place is more than just a shop, Marcus murmured to himself. It's home. And with that, he felt at peace. The neighborhood had reclaimed what was theirs, not just the barber shop, but their dignity, their sense of community, and their future. And Marcus had played his part in making sure that future would be a bright one. The door jingled again as it opened, and Marcus smiled to himself. No matter what came next, the people of this neighborhood would be ready, together.